The Subcommittee for Interior, Energy, and Environment will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. Oh, and I see our last witness has arrived. Welcome. So I'll begin with my opening statement. Welcome and thank you for joining us this afternoon. The Subcommittee on Interior, Energy, and Environment is meeting today to discuss the importance of access to our public lands managed by the Forest Service. The Forest Service manages about 200 million acres of land, more than 370,000 miles of roads, and more than 158,000 miles of recreational trails across the United States. Land that should be open and accessible for use and enjoyment of all Americans. Unfortunately, the Forest Service seems to be moving away from its original multiple-use mission. Although Congress has directed the Forest Service to manage land for grazing, recreation, and wildlife habitat, among other things, the Forest Service has locked up our public lands instead. My home state of Montana is a perfect example. According to a report by the Montana State Legislature's Environmental Quality Council, the Forest Service has closed more than 21,000 miles of roads in Montana since the mid-1990s. That's nearly 1/3 of all the Forest Service roads in the state. Kerry White, Montana State Representative who introduced the resolution to commission the report, is here today to discuss this important topic. Access to public lands is not a problem just in Montana. We know the Forest Service is closing and decommissioning roads in other states as well. That's why we'll also hear from witnesses from California and Oregon who can share the challenges of access to Forest Service land in their communities. Keeping Forest Service land open to the public is important for a number of reasons. First, we need to preserve access for hiking, camping, hunting, fishing, and other outdoor recreation, the benefits of which speak for themselves. When the Forest Service blocks off roads and places excessive restrictions on public lands, it prevents people from participating in America's outdoor heritage. Outdoor recreation is also big business. Each year, people spend $887 billion on outdoor recreation, and the industry creates 7.6 million American jobs. Some of these jobs are with small business that depend on visitors to our public lands, such as guides, outfitters, ski areas, off-road vehicles, and snowmobile dealers, even restaurants and gas stations. Additionally, access to forest lands can help prevent the spread of wildfires. If firefighters cannot quickly reach fires on the ground, more acres burn and more firefighting resources become necessary. Despite the measurable benefits of access to public lands, the Forest Service is under pressure to close and decommission thousands of miles of Forest Service managed trails and roads. Burdensome regulations, inconsistent policies, lack of proper maintenance, and the constant threat of litigation all contribute to the trend towards road closures. The witnesses here today can discuss the importance of access to the Forest Service land, why the agency has trended toward road closures in recent years, and what we can do to restore public access to our public lands. The Forest Service certainly has room for improvement. However, this administration has made it clear that it's absolutely imperative for federal agencies to work with states and local communities instead of dictating land management decisions from Washington. That's why I hope to see strong, accountable leadership at the Forest Service soon. Finally, I want to say thank you to all the witnesses, some of whom traveled across the country to be here, and I look forward to hearing your testimony. I now recognize my friend, the ranking member, for her comments.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing today, and welcome to the committee.
Thank you.
This is going to be wonderful having you working together. We can all agree that our national forests administered by the U.S. Forest Service are among our nation's treasure and that they should be enjoyed by all. That is why it's been a long-standing policy for decades by both Republican and Democratic administrations to regulate the use of off-highway vehicles on Forest Service lands and roads. This policy stretches back to President Nixon, who in 1972 issued an executive order defining off-highway vehicles and directing agencies to manage their use on public lands so as to protect the resources of those lands, promote safety, and minimize conflicts among the various users of those lands. Still, the use of off-highway vehicles on Forest Service land soared since 1970s, so much so that Dale Bosworth, President George W. Bush's chief of U.S. Forest Service, listed unmanaged outdoor recreation as one of the 4 major threats to the health of the nation's forests. Mr. Bosworth specifically mentioned off-highway vehicle users as part of the threat. He said, quote, 99% of the users are careful to protect the land. But with all of those millions of users, even a tiny percentage of problem use becomes relatively huge. Each year, the national forests and grasslands get hundreds of miles of unauthorized roads and trails due to repeated cross-country use. We're seeing more erosion, water degradation, and habitat destruction. We're seeing more conflicts between users. We've got to improve our management so we get responsible recreational use based on sound outdoor ethics. Mr. Bosworth made it clear that to enable our national forests to accommodate a variety of uses, we cannot forget that there are costs to certain types of uses, not just benefits. And I'm hopeful that in this hearing, we'll hear other issues on how we can work together to ensure that those different users and the different constituencies are managed properly. To address the problem of environmental degradation created by some off-highway vehicle users, the Bush-era Forest Service issued the Travel Management Rule. The rule is designed to guide Forest Service managers' decisions by looking to those goals contained in President Nixon's executive order: sustained resource values, provide economic benefits to rural communities, promote safety, and minimize conflict among various users. The rule also explicitly requires public involvement and has a responsive process that is aimed at long-term solutions for the transportation system through a given forest. While I do not have a national forest in my district, the U.S. Virgin Islands, we do have lands managed by the National Park Service. Tremendous amount of lands and percentages, particularly on the island of St. John. I'm familiar with the issue of public access to our natural resources. I hear far too often, frequently from our constituents who are involved in disputes with the National Park Service concerning what they believe is deliberately blocked roadways and land easement disputes, which are just, in some instances, to many of those constituents, generational. We have seen an alarming escalation in the amount of residents engaged in real estate boundary and property line challenges with the National Park Service as well. It has been my experience that public access to government-owned lands are best resolved through public engagement in finding a balance between environmental and the communities in which those environments resides interests. I hope that today's hearing will provide this opportunity. Finally, as I close, let me say that I'm hopeful that the committee will convene to examine how the Forest Service is handling sexual harassment allegations within the agencies as well. In December 2016, the committee held a hearing to examine sexual harassment in the U.S. Department of Agriculture, including the Forest Service. During that hearing, the committee heard from whistleblowers who described not only how they had suffered prolonged harassment, but how they had also suffered retaliation when they reported the harassment. When the Forest Service had established a new process to handle sexual harassment allegations, it was clear that significant challenges remained and that many women are still scared to come forward. A recent PBS NewsHour investigation of the Forest Service, which was entitled, "They Reported Sexual Harassment, Then Retaliation Began," featured disturbing interviews with several Forest Service veterans who reported not only assaults, but also harassments. So I'd love for us to get an update on the committee's hearing from December 16th. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that. I'm now very pleased to introduce our witnesses today. Mr. Bill Harvey is Commissioner and Chair of Baker County, Oregon. Ms. Amy Granite, Managing Director of the California Off-Road Vehicle Association. Mr. Jim Furnish, Consulting Forester and former U.S. Forest Service Deputy Chief for the National Forest Systems, and the Honorable Carrie White, representative in the Montana House of Representatives. Welcome to all of you. Pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before we testify. Please remain seated and just raise your right hand if you would. Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. To allow time for discussion, we're going to ask for each person to limit their comments to 5 minutes. Your entire written testimony will be entered into the record. As a reminder, the clock in front of you shows your remaining time. The light will turn yellow when you have 30 seconds and red when your time is up. Please also remember to press the button. You have to turn your microphone on to speak. At this time, we'll start with Mr. Harvey, if you would, for your 5 minutes of testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Ranking member and committee members, thank you for today. I'm gratefully honored to be here today to speak to this issue in particular. I am a county commission chairman. That means I deal with the on-the-ground, everyday issues with the people, and land issues is the one thing I work on every single day of my career. This is a career that I've taken on because of the need from the citizens of my county have emphasized they needed help to accomplish these things. In your statements, both of you mentioned things about Forest Service management, and I'd like to add to that mismanagement. Also, it's not the Forest Service land. They manage it for the public. That's very important to our area, especially, and our Forest Service address it that way. So I'd like to give you a little background on Baker County, and that's where I'm from. This is in eastern Oregon. It's a drier climate than what the coast is, so we get about 12 inches of measurable moisture a year that's in the form of snow and rain. So road issues, there is little to no erosion in our area because the roads have been there for over 50 years. And the only time you have erosion issues is when the Forest Service comes in and rips them up with a cat. They say that they have no money for restoration or maintenance or what have you, yet they spend a fortune in tearing roads out, good roads, roads that have been in place and used for vehicle traffic and off-road traffic and what have you. I'm not sure if Mr. Bush's team ever visited Eastern Oregon, but I would have gladly taken them out, either horseback riding, walking, hiking, or motorized travel as well. Motorized travel is very important in Baker County because we have 3,000 square miles in Baker County. That's bigger than the states of Rhode Island and Delaware. We have 2 million acres of land in Baker County. Half of it, 51.5%, is managed by the federal government, both by BLM and the Forest Service. Some of the things that we have left in the remaining 48% of our land is approximately 950,000 acres plus, is for roads, rivers, towns, and private property. The citizens of Baker County rely on both public and private land for natural resources, recreation, and the ability to continue our way of life, especially for agriculture, livestock grazing, mining, and timber harvests. Therefore, all of the decisions affecting public lands could potentially affect Baker County's economy, customs, culture, and enjoyment of the land. When I moved to Baker County in 1972, the county had 6 timber mills, but we have none now. The forest keeps growing. The reason they did that was more of a philosophy change, not any sound science, no management principles or anything, just a change in philosophy. Well, our forests haven't changed. They're continuing to grow, they're continuing to die, they're continuing to be overcrowded. As an example, Baker City watershed, 10,000 acres. In historically measures, in 1900, there actually was pictures of it, there was 50 trees per acre. Today, we currently have 1,000 trees per acre. This watershed serves a town of 10,000 people. It is in drastic threat every single year. On average, we have 4 fires in the watershed a year. Miraculously, we throw everything we have at it instantly to take care of that issue, but we're not going to be able to keep it up. When I took office in 2015, we had historical fires, the level that we have never had in any of our county whatsoever, or since yet. And I emphasize yet. We had 4 major forest fires going on at the same time. We had 500 to 600 personnel from the Forest Service and BLM and everybody else there in Baker City trying to manage this fire. emphasize manage fire. We no longer fight fires, we manage them. Unfortunately, we manage them so that it's a big business. We bring a lot of people in clear across the country because they're first on the list to come and fight fires. I have fought very hard to allow our local firefighters to fight these fires immediately so that there's no threat to what the town is. I'd like to talk about coordination. Coordination is a principle and a way that we could actually make things happen. It is the law. Congress installed it, and I'd like to use that. If you wanted to have some of the things that work, that would be a great start to begin with. But the threat to our county economy is also severe when you limit the access that we have to our forests, and we do need those forests to help do that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Harvey, and we'll recognize Ms. Granite for her comments for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, Madam Ranking Member, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify. We work in partnership, California Off-Road Vehicle Association with Sierra Access Coalition, both organizations working to protect forest access for a range of public uses. In 2004, former Chief Bosworth defined 4 major threats to our forests, including invasive species, wildfire, and loss of open space. However, the 4th threat, off-road recreation, directly targeted motorized-dependent activities, and by doing so, declared it an unacceptable use of forested land. The Travel Management Rule, or TMR, called thousands of miles of road and trail closures through massive NEPA analyses that harm businesses, communities, disabled individuals, and every form of overland and over snow travel. The public lost significant access to areas they loved. Although former Chief Bosworth also stated in 2004 that other forms of recreation can cause damage, horseback riding, bike riding, even hiking or camping, none of those uses have ever been subject to closure, curtailment, or regulatory action. The TMR requires people to limit travels to routes on a map called a motor vehicle use map. It is a poor map with no landmarks, but somehow people are supposed to follow only those routes shown. It's printed on a flimsy sheet of newsprint. The agency states that the MVUM, or Motor Vehicle Use Map, is not intended to be a navigational tool, but it is the legally binding enforcement tool. Without knowing where they are, people can face fines of $5,000 and/or 6-month imprisonment if found on the wrong road. Environmental organizations played a key role in the TMR decision-making process. The Wilderness Society wrote a travel management wish list to the agency stating, "We intend to provide as much data as we can to the region." Biologists from the Wilderness Society also provided transportation-related data for the travel management planning process. They provide the data, then they get their way. To support closure decisions, the Forest Service used unverified and incomplete information in National Visitor Use Monitoring, or NVUM surveys, to downplay the importance of motorized access. For the Inyo National Forest, for example, the NVUM indicated almost 0% OHV activity, but information submitted on grant applications to the state of California showed 22% OHV primary activity visits. Both sets of data cannot be true at the same time. Information submitted to the state was subject to review and audit, therefore it represents the true numbers. The Forest Service failed to coordinate with local governments, although regulations state agencies shall cooperate to the fullest extent possible to better integrate environmental impact statements into state and local planning processes. This strongly applies a working relationship with local governments and coordination/compliance with local planning. This issue is a high priority and deserves clarification and consequences in law. Coordination or compliance lacks teeth, requiring agencies to work in a meaningful manner with local governments. The travel management rule has also been devastating to fire suppression efforts. Previously, fires were accessible to initial attack. With roads closed, fires burn out of control and make it difficult to get a dozer to cut a road near a fire. Catastrophic wildfire has increased exponentially on Forest Service land in California. Environmental groups may claim that road closures are beneficial to watershed, but sedimentation from a road can be mitigated and pales in comparison to sedimentation from a watershed devastated by wildfire. Travel management decisions have had a disproportionate impact on disabled visitors. The analysis for the El Dorado National Forest stated, restrictions on public wheeled motor vehicle use will impact persons with disabilities to a greater extent, particularly for those routes which provide access to recreation opportunities such as dispersed camping, streamside access, etc. But the agency dismissed all disabled concerns. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973 says that no person can be denied participation in a federal program or facility solely because of their disability. National forests are owned by the American people and funded by American citizens. The Forest Service is actively denying participation to disabled Americans and granting greater access to able-bodied Americans, making the disabled second-class citizens. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Ms. Granite. And now we'll recognize Mr. Furnish for your 5 minutes of testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Gianforte and Ranking Member Plaskett. I am Jim Furnish, former USDA Forest Service Deputy Chief for National Forest Systems. I retired in 2002 following a 35-year career in the agency. This career included jobs as a district ranger, also a forest supervisor. I manage national forests and their complex issues at both the policy level and the practical field level. I'm well acquainted with these issues, and I bring a wealth of experience. As a Bighorn National Forest Ranger from 77 to 84, I took aggressive steps to reduce four-wheel drive roads and trails. As Siuslaw National Forest Supervisor from 1991 to 1999, I completed a travel plan for the Oregon Dunes National Recreation Area, a globally significant off-highway vehicle area. Now today I hope to speak to four main issues. One is the emergence of off-highway vehicles as a potent force in reshaping land management considerations. Second, the consequence of inadequate funding of road and trail maintenance and access. Third, the adequacy of agency coordination with affected interests and parties. And fourth, the ideological battle over perceived public rights to recreate on public lands. I'd like to take you back when I first started working for the Forest Service in the mid-60s. OHVs were virtually unheard of. I watched this machine and the users and the recreation activity blossom over the course of my career to become one of the most dominant effects on our land management issues and the public we serve. I left the agency just before the travel management regulation that's been referenced, but this was an effort to address, for the first time really in a comprehensive way, the issue of off-highway vehicles and to strike a balance between appropriate use and access of the land and these machines with other necessary restrictions associated with the negative consequences. Historians will argue whether the Forest Service has done a good job because this effort continues, but the travel management regulation, in my view, as an extension of Nixon's earlier executive order back in the 70s, is part of the same tapestry that the Forest Service is using to try to get their arms around this vexing issue. It's been very much complicated by the funding. The Forest Service, for as long as I've been in the agency and since, has struggled with lack of road maintenance dollars as well as travel maintenance dollars. And this issue has been exacerbated in the recent decades relative to fire funding. And I would like to say that Congress has stepped up to trying to deal with that fire funding issue. And so that has helped, but nevertheless, the Forest Service continues to be chronically short of road maintenance and trail maintenance dollars. I would also say you can never get enough thoughtful cooperation, which brings me to coordination with groups and individuals interested in OHV issues, and more broadly, access to public lands. The Forest Service, as required by law and policy, has since its very inception in the late 1800s, sought to coordinate with interested parties in reaching decisions. Seeking out and considering the views of all sides of an issue are the essence of public service. The agency uses public notices, holds public meetings, and has created numerous resource advisory committees, all in a spirit of coordination. All these are commonly used in dealing with OHV and access issues. I routinely accepted requests to meet with OHV advocates and groups, and these meetings often involved field trips to look at issues firsthand. Which leads me to say there is a difference between listening, understanding, and agreeing. I think some parties do not feel listened to, coordinated with, when they are not agreed with. Put another way, coordination is deemed ineffective or non-existent if decisions and outcomes are seen as unsatisfactory. I do not believe coordination necessitates agreement, especially when considering multiple viewpoints on contentious issues. And by far the thorniest issue is an ideological one. For example, what does public land mean? What rights does it confer on citizens? What reasonable authority is vested in agency officials discharging their responsibility to manage OHVs and access in the public interest? And I would say, in reference to your comment that national forests are locked up, I would say they are open for business. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Furnish. And at this time, I'd like to recognize Representative White for your 5 minutes of testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Little background on myself. My family's been in the Gallatin Valley for 150 years. My great-grandfather came there when he was 13 years old. And I've seen quite a change in the Forest Service over those years. Our family is a leaseholder with a cabin in the Storm Castle drainage. We currently pay over $3,000 a year in lease, but we only have access to the cabin half of the year because of the travel management plan that was passed by the Forest Service in 2004. When they came out with that plan, myself and 11 other folks started Citizens for Balanced Use to try to understand why the Forest Service was closing about 50% of the roads and trails in that forest to motorized use. There was closures proposed for bicycles and mechanized use, and there's also proposed closures to horse. They came out with a draft environmental impact statement over 1,500 pages. And after that, they came out with a final environmental impact statement over 1,500 pages and asked the public to consume and digest this document and provide substantive comments to the Forest Service. The general public is not the Forest Service with professionals to comprehend a document of that size. After that, the document was approved. The record of decision was signed. CBU sued that in federal court in Missoula. We ultimately lost. We appealed that to federal court of the Ninth Circuit in California, and we ultimately lost. And that's our last opportunity. The Supreme Court's not going to take a case on travel management rule and locking people out of the forest. I'd like you to take a look at the written testimony that I submitted. There's a photo there of the DEIS and the FEIS with the ruler showing the massive amount of document that's prepared by the Forest Service that the public is asked to look at. There's also a couple of pages of road closures. This is how the Forest Service closes the roads. They call them rip, slash, and seed, where they tear live trees out of the ground, stack them across the road. It blocks access for not only motorized and mechanized use, but also hiking, horseback, cross-country skiing. There has been, and I would agree with Mr. Furnish, a significant increase in OHV use, but I would also refer to the Recreation Specialist report from the Gallatin that shows national trends indicate that aging populations may desire more accessible opportunities. Our population is aging. We need those recreation, those access. There's also a photo illustration of 4 major cities in Montana last summer where air quality was hazardous. And there's also a report from the USDA 2013 wildland firefighter smoke exposure and the toxins that is in this smoke. There's also a chart from Montana Department of Environmental Quality, the state in which I'm from, that shows the effects from wildfire smoke. And in the top 4 categories of that chart, it will show you it causes premature mortality. In other words, these fires are killing people because of the toxins that are released in the air. There's also a picture that I've attached there of the erosion. that happens, the sedimentation that goes into our streams. It shows the condition of our forest out there. Some of our forests out there are over 80% dead. And the Forest Service is not cutting the timber. We're not managing it actively. They're actually proposing to do more prescribed burns, which if you look at that report from the firefighter smoke, those toxins are released whether they are wildfire or prescribed burns. I just would ask this committee to bring attention to what we're faced in Montana. Over almost 22,000 miles of roads closed. And I would just ask you to think a minute. The emotional impact that these closures have on a father or a grandfather that cannot take their kids or their grandkids to those places that they shared with their father or their grandfather before them, as there's a closed gate or obliterated road. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. White, and thank you for the panel for your testimony. We'll now move to the period where the committee gets to ask questions, and I'll start, if I could. Back to you, Representative White. Could you please explain to the committee what prompted the need to study road closures in Montana? You initiated that in the state legislature, and it was completed by Department of Environmental Quality. But help us with why did you do that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I first was elected to the legislature in 2013. I carried a bill that allowed the growth policy to be the legal document to coordinate because we were seeing road closures. 2004, as I mentioned, CBU was started, and through that organization, when I became a legislator, phone call after phone call, and you as legislators understand when there's an issue out there that's of importance, you get phone calls, and that's really what prompted it from one end of the state to the other from other states. And so I brought a study, HJ 13. I just wanted to see how much access we had lost, that Forest Service and BLM, that study covers both of them, how much access we had lost in the last 20 years. So what prompted it was a public outcry that we're losing access.
And again, just for the record, the study showed that 1/3 of all the roads in Montana had been closed by the Forest Service and BLM. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Again, for Mr. White, does the Forest Service have reliable data on road closures? And would you suggest that other states do similar studies?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I would suggest that other states initiate a study like this. When we did this under the Environmental Quality Council, of which I was a member of, and I chaired that subcommittee that was working on it, we worked on with a liaison with the BLM and a liaison with the Forest Service that helped go through that study. But it was a long and tedious process because each one of those forests had to try to go back and find that information. And in fact, the BLM is very lacking on their records and their inventory of roads and trails. The Forest Service was able to garner that information from all those, I think might be 13 different forests within the state of Montana. And then our staff with the Environmental Quality Council put together that report. I have a link to that report that I submitted. If you go to that link, it's an interactive link. There's lots of things you can do through that link, as those links inside of the study are active links to be able to do that. I would suggest that other states do that. First of all, because it would produce an accurate inventory of what is out there on the ground, and then look back at what we've lost for access.
Okay. Ms. Granite, could you describe the consequences of losing access to public land?
The consequences are very broad, Mr. Chair. Every aspect of community life is affected, and for California, we have 19 forests. There isn't any other state that has as many forests as we do. So we have rural communities up and down the spine of the Sierra Nevada, up until Northern California, that are not, by far, not wealthy communities. You take a little bit of recreation, tourism away from them, and they start suffering. There's high poverty rates, there are higher jobless rates, There's a lack of services. One of the biggest problems is the lack of timber harvests, because timber harvests, out of that, 25% used to go to schools and to road maintenance dollars of the proceeds of the harvest of the timber sale. After now, there is no timber sales, or are no timber sales. There was a measure, Secure Rural School funding, which tried to make up some of it, but where before there were a few $1 million that went to local economies, now it's much, much lower. So really, older people are suffering and school children are suffering.
Could you explain a little more about the economic impact on the local communities from lack of access?
Well, it's a very interesting thing because I've actually studied the difference between motorized and non-motorized recreationists. The majority of non-motorized recreations don't spend time in the local communities. They go out and go to their trailheads. They come back. Most of their equipment is purchased where they live in local stores. Motorized enthusiasts spend a lot of time. They go to hotel rooms. They go to restaurants. They do like to eat well, I'd say. And they spend time in the local communities, and they go back often to those communities. Hunters, for example, will spend easily $1,300 to $2,000 a weekend.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Gannett. At this time, I'd like to
Any other questions for the chair? You can go longer.
Okay, well, I'd ask the same question to Mr. Harvey. What are the consequences of losing access to public lands?
Well, first off, we had a vibrant timber industry at one time, and they said, well, because of that, we'll open up the opportunities for having travel in the forest so that you can have a recreational economy. We did that. We expanded our efforts, we've promoted it, and we've done all that. And that's one of the part of the recreation that we have now is the biggest economy in Baker County, next to agriculture. But without the access, we have none. We're trying to expand it right now, use of off-road vehicles, and also bike riding, mountain bike riding now. But if these same accesses are closed to one, they're going to be closed to both. And if you put everybody in the same area and diminish the amount of roads, then you create a dust hazard for everybody. And you're also putting multi-uses on the same road. So you'll have off-road vehicles, you have four-wheel truck driving, you'll have potential log trucks on private land sales, and you'll have people who are horseback riding or what have you. This is a danger that we can't survive with. But if you close off the roads as they're trying to do right now, which is about 4,000 more miles of roads in Baker County, we don't have as much as Montana, but that's the lifeblood that we have. I live out there. I have for 45 years. I utilize that. I do off-road vehicle travel. I do horseback riding. Many ranchers take supplies out for their cattle on four-wheel drives and off-road vehicles so they can get to the down areas that they need to get salt to their cattle. This whole area is a truly multi-use activity, and that's what benefits Baker County. Without our access, we can't do the thinning projects and we can't do logging. So this does affect the economy.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Harvey. At this time, I'd like to recognize the ranking member, Ms. Plaskett, for her questions.
Thank you very much. And this is really very interesting, the testimony and your questioning, Mr. Chair. I'm appreciative of the information that's been shared here. Mr. Furnish, thank you so much for giving us your insights and experiences at this hearing today. You state in your testimony that by law and policy, the Forest Service has always sought to coordinate with interested parties. And that in such coordination, the Forest Service uses public notice, public meetings, numerous advisory committees to make decisions. Is that correct?
Correct.
Can you give us an example of what that public notice would entail, how the public would be notified, and how that information would be disseminated?
Well, oftentimes these are legal notices in local newspapers as well as articles that show up in local newspapers. They put flyers and posters around local communities, libraries. If there are radio shows, they will often go on the radio, advertise upcoming meetings. And I would just say that in my experience, the popularity of these open meetings to discuss contentious issues on national forests would provide the best testimony that people hear about this.
I know
They
in
are-
my
they are
own,
not
that's,
in- They are not in the dark.
Well, I know in my own community, you get a certain group of people that are very interested in this, and they're usually there to voice their concerns.
Yeah.
When you talk about numerous advisory committees, what do you mean by that?
Well, there was a provision a number of years ago for, I think the term is Resource Advisory Committees, or RACs. This would be one example of a federally constituted committee, and they have open meetings with selected representatives from all different constituencies. There are also ad hoc committees that deal on an issue-oriented basis, that type of thing. So there are any number of groups and organizations that the Forest Service works with, both formally and informally.
So one of the things that I think is key, and we've heard it a number of times in different testimony, is this idea about coordination.
Yes.
And the coordination that's required under the law, and how does that actually take place on the ground? You talked from your own experience, being as a Forest Service manager, of having to coordinate different viewpoints. Can you explain to us what those different viewpoints were, and how do you weigh that? How does that occur in your practical experience?
Well, it's difficult.
It's still giving you pause, even
Yeah,
after all these years of
I
retirement?
mean, it's difficult just because it's something of an art as well as a science. But, I mean, let me take you to the Oregon Dunes National Recreation Area. This was a fantastic dune system on the Oregon coast. It's one of the world's best off-highway vehicle riding areas and enormously popular, and it's a huge economic driver for the local communities. We had formal meetings. We did an EIS. We did all of that kind of stuff. And some of these meetings were attended by hundreds of people. But we also did field trips. And I had an associate there, Arnold Ryland, who worked with Oregon Off-Highway Vehicle Association, I'm sure much like the woman here from California. And Arnold and I met repeatedly in office as well as out in the field so that he could share his views, I could share my views. And I also met with conservation groups who frankly didn't like off-highway vehicles and wanted to know what I was going to do to restrict them. I would just say that we came up with, in the long run, what I think was a fairly balanced plan that gave all parties some of what they wanted and also denied all parties some of what they wanted.
So, for example, in the discussion that we've had, what, for instance, would you characterize the views of hunters and fishermen at the same time off-highways vehicle users? Are there times when those viewpoints converge, or are they usually oppositional to one another? How do you manage that?
Well, you know, it's interesting. The hunting and fishing community, I think, illustrates within itself a conflict and a contrast, because I happen to know some dear friends who are resolute about never using an off-highway vehicle in the pursuit of hunting. I also know fishermen who are determined to hike in. I also know those who would like to be able to drive an OHV up to their bagged game, throw it in back, and drive back to camp. I know fishermen who would like to be able to drive right up to a platform that's provided for people with disabilities. All these things, I would argue, are necessary, but it's impossible to provide them everywhere, all the time, for all people.
So the travel management rule requires that the Forest Service involve the public. So let me move on to that. I wanted to ask you about the funding. You talked about funding issues that you have.
Yes.
Can you explain that a little bit more?
Well, bear in mind, I left the Forest Service in 2002, so I'm not as conversant as I was when I was the deputy chief. But I would just say throughout my career, I would say this has been an area of chronic underfunding of both road maintenance as well as trail maintenance. And I would argue it's a simple business proposition. If you don't have the necessary funding to take care of your business, you need to whittle it down. And so this was largely driven by the creation of many of these roads and trails through two things. The first was timber activity, which we saw many of the national forests logged from the 50s throughout the 90s, that created thousands and thousands of miles of road. Also, unrestrained off-highway vehicles that created numerous, hundreds of thousands of miles of trails that were not engineered. These two features, I would argue, logging roads as well as off-highway vehicle created trails, came to a real loggerheads with the lack of funding. and necessitated this travel management regulation and the necessary comprehensive planning to try to right-size the trail and road system.
Thank you, and thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Yeah, thank you. At this time, the chair recognizes Mr. Gosar for his questions.
So, Mr. Furnish, isn't a lot of the underfunding fire borrowing? Because we've seen this advent since you've been in the Forest Service, these huge catastrophic fires. And so we strip all the rest of the funding for the Forest Service because we got to pay for these humongous catastrophic fires. Isn't that true? The answer is yes. I don't want you to get in any crossways.
No, you can.
I'm from
you can answer
Arizona,
for me.
and I'm originally from Wyoming. So it's been brought to my attention that a Forest Service gate was placed across Forest Road 219 Horseshoe Bend Road, blocking access to considerable public land acres behind the gate, as right here, with no appropriate level of analysis or document rationale to do so. Further, it's my understanding this gate is locked, and recreation staff who manage the float trips on your forest are one of the few who have a key. Now, this is a serious matter. If access is impacted for state and local government administrations, in addition to the fact that it prohibits public use of public land and legal obligations of permitted grazing allotment management. Just to let you know, what this basically says is it says wilderness, and it's not even close to a wilderness.
Well, I can't see the pictures.
Well, I'm explaining to you. You don't have to trust me on this one, okay?
I'll try.
So, additionally to this gate, for some time there was a sign that read, National Forest Wilderness, misleading the public that directly behind the gate is a wilderness. This picture shows that wilderness area isn't there. This is and has never been designated a wilderness area. And on quite the contrary, there are many acres of multiple use lands directly beyond this gate before the true wilderness begins. So this is not your just average gate, okay? This is severely constructed.
I assume that's a road, not a trail.
It's a road, yeah. And here it is. You can see where the road comes down the bottom right-hand corner to, yeah, your right-hand corner, and you can see private, and then way over here is the wilderness. Here's the gate, gives you a little bit more application here. So, I mean, you know, once again, we constantly have these problems. Now, is it common practice for the Forest Service to put up gates blocking access and signs designating wilderness and non-wilderness areas?
I would hope no.
I just showed you one.
Well, you asked me if it's common practice. We have 200 million.
I got a whole bunch of them in Arizona.
You're showing me.
I mean, I can tell you right now, Mr. Furnish, I mean, you came as an expert here. And so we had, my first term, we had the Wallow Fire up in northeastern Arizona.
Familiar with it. Yeah.
Okay? And what ended up happening is they actually closed the roads. They locked them up. And I went to the chief and I said, listen, you got a problem coming. Because what you're doing is you're locking people out of their livelihood. And what's going to happen, we're going to have a gunfight, someone's going to get killed, and it's your problem. I instantly had the sheriffs who had all the keys. So we got a problem here. This isn't exactly what you have stated, is that we've had these catastrophic wildfires, and the reason we have those catastrophic fires is because we've mismanaged the forest. And what ends up happening is before that time, we didn't have these kind of catastrophic fires in Arizona because they were limited to 8,000 acres or less because we had access to those, because we had fundamental access to the livelihood called the forest. You either manage it or it manages you. So now, Mr. White, a comment was made about recreation and trout fishermen and stuff. When you have these catastrophic fires, does it help trout?
No, sir.
It actually kills them off, doesn't it?
Yes, sir.
Because what ends up happening, these forest fires are so intensely hot that they actually sterilize the soil.
Yes, sir. I actually had pictures I was going to provide the committee on elk that were burned up, domestic livestock, horses, cows, fish baked in the streams, squirrels. Everything in the forest is completely incinerated, but I just didn't give that to the committee.
I want you to bring those pictures. Now,
I
Mr.
will.
Furnish, I'm going to ask you another question. What's worse? What is easier mitigated, a road or sterilized soil from a catastrophic fire?
What is easier to
What's
mitigate?
easier mitigated ecologically? A road
Well,
or
it depends on-
catastrophically
That
incinerated
depends on
soil?
many things. It depends on how many acres of
Now, I
such
tell you what,
sterilized soil you're.
sterilized
talking about.
soil is
Are you
by
talking
far
about a
won't be
50-mile
mitigated.
road or a 1-mile
Well,
road?
let me give you the
2,000
science.
acres of sterilized soils, 100
It takes
acres?
50 years just to get microbes in sterilized soil. 50 years. Mr. Harvey, is it easier to mitigate that road or that sterilized soil?
The roads are far more easy
That's
to
what I
mitigate.
thought. That's what I thought. Mr. Chairman, once again, when we have these discussions about locking up the access to the public, it would be nice to have specialists that actually can talk about this that are currently involved in the Forest Service so they can be held accountable. I yield back.
Okay, thank you. At this time, the chair would recognize Mr. Palmer for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And if I could, just 1 second, I think that with the number of committee members here, we'll probably do another round if people want to stay.
Okay.
And I talked to the ranking member about that, so go ahead, Mr. Palmer.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman, reclaiming my time. We've had some discussion as we're just now about forest management. There was also the issue of managing forests, particularly old-growth forests, relative to the spotted owl, and the Forest Service and the various federal agencies came up with this idea that it had to be all old growth. Turns out that wasn't the case. I mean, once they figured out that the spotted owl provide preferred cover in taller trees and not the extensive canopy cover of the smaller trees, they realized the biggest threat was the barred owl. I mean, they literally, Mr. Chairman, we're making a decision to hire people to go out and kill barred owls. So we've been all over the roadmap, if not the forest floor roadmap, on how to manage forest. And a lot of what has been discussed is wrong. In regard to, I'm a forest owner, by the way, private landowner, and I understand that the buildup of fuel on the forest floor is extremely dangerous. It's dangerous for your investment. It's dangerous to neighboring landowners, and it's certainly been catastrophically dangerous in a number of our western states with uncontrolled forest fires, and it's largely because of poor forest management and lack of access. And it creates a greater danger for those fighting forest, because once you get into an area that doesn't have access, you really do isolate firefighters and put them in grave danger at times. So my point is, Mr. Furness, you testified in a hearing almost a year ago, a year and 2 weeks ago tomorrow, or today actually, on resilient forest. And a bill that I thought was a very sensible approach to managing our federal forest. It allowed for management of the forest, much like I try to manage the forest land that I'm a part owner in. But you had this position that it was endangered the forest to allow to go in and remove trees that don't have a benefit for wildlife, particularly. There's some that do, but that somehow you concluded that it would disturb the forest. And what we've seen are hundreds of millions of acres that have been lost. I don't understand that. You go look at some of the state-managed forests, not all of them, but some of them, and it's a decided advantage. And again, looking at the privately managed forest. So I just wonder if what you're thinking is in regard to limiting access. And I'm understand not wanting to have four-wheelers racing all over forest land. I get that. You can manage that. I managed it on my property. But why would we not want to get in and make sure that we have healthy forest? Because what we're seeing right now is not working. Mr. Harvey?
No, sir, it's not. And I'd like to touch base on coordination because that's a key aspect of it. It's not working on the ground. When I talked to the Forest Service supervisor in my area and the district ranger, I asked, do you even know what I'm talking about? And they said, no, we've never heard of it. So maybe in Washington DC, they talked about it, but they did not transfer that down to the ground level that I have to deal with on a daily basis. We as four-wheelers, horseback riders, what have you, we're in the forest. When we see a danger, we call it in immediately. We diminish the threat to our forest. We manage our forests on private land and state lands far greater than the Forest Service even remotely comes close to. So yeah, proper management can happen, it does happen, but not at that level. And they also say we don't have enough money. The problem with not having enough money, it's growing right in front of you. It's
That's
called
exact-
trees.
That's exactly right. The only forester in Congress is Congressman Bruce Westerman, who's a dear friend of mine. And we have forest management as a common interest. And the thing about properly managing forest is that you get the fuel off the forest floor. You are able to manage it to protect it from severe drought situations by thinning. And you also protect it from insect infestation. We've got this issue in Alabama with the pine beetles where you literally have to go in and remove the infected trees and the trees in the adjacent area. That's how you preserve the forest. And Representative White, you mentioned, I don't know where you got the number, but you said 80% of the trees are dead. I've flown over some forests and looking down in the summertime at the canopy and see the dead trees and know that is going to eventually spread to other areas if you don't get in and cut those out. If I may allow the witness to comment, I yield back.
Thank you, Representative. We had a massive outbreak of beetle kill in Montana. We tried to get in and maybe harvest some of those trees. Litigation pretty much stopped that from environmental groups that actually don't want any kind of active forest management. They support burning it. Now those trees, after that amount of time, they're just falling over. The fuel load on the floor of the forest is unreal in some of those areas. And the wildlife, this study, HJ 13 study, will show a movement of wildlife from public lands to private property, an increase in wildlife because of the habitat degradation on those public lands. There is no habitat for those animals. So we're seeing an influx of animals on private land, which then causes an economic hardship on those private landowners. So it's kind of a catch-22.
Okay, so I think they're called votes for like 20 minutes. We probably have enough time for another round of questions here. And if I could start with you, Mr. White. I wanted to go back to your example about this lease you have. Is that on forest land?
Yes, sir. My grandfather got that in 1934.
So it's been in the family a while. And,
My grandfather and grandmother built the cabin, hand-peeled the logs.
and you used to have year-round access to that cabin?
Yes, we did.
And when did the access get restricted?
2008, when the travel plan was signed, they put a gate at the bridge. And when I say we used to have year-round access, that was by vehicle travel. Now we can access it in the wintertime if there's enough snow cover on the road for snowmobiles. But where they put the gate, there's about 2 or 3 miles that melts out real early. So there's a month or two that we cannot access it at all.
Okay, when this travel plan was changed, were your lease arrangements reduced to compensate you for not having access to the property?
No, sir.
Okay, and we heard about all this public notice. You talked about the 1,500-page document that you had to review. Were there public meetings related to this travel plan?
Yes, they were, Mr. Chairman. And, you know, I think years ago in the public hearing, the Forest Service would sit up there and answer questions from the public in a public setting. Now what you have is little stations and little tables where you go around and there'll be a hydrologist and there'll be a silviculturist and there'll be a recreation manager. And so, you know, they kind of tend to separate the people and the people don't really have the opportunity to ask those questions.
Do you feel through that, you went through that process?
Yes.
Do you feel that your concerns were incorporated into the travel management plan?
No, sir.
Okay. We've heard a lot of discussion today about off-highway vehicles. But isn't it the case that many of these road closures are not about off-highway vehicles? They're about pickup trucks just transporting people on developed roads?
Mr. Chairman, the pictures that I showed of those road closures, rip, slash, and seed, they are completely obliterating that road or trail. It's gone for everyone. No more maintenance on that trail because that trail never existed. And I provided copies of maps from 1934 to the Forest Service and all the trails that were on that. And you look at a current Forest Service map and you will see once they obliterate that trail, they remove it from the map. It was like it was never there. So when they say that these were user-created routes and stuff, I challenge them to look at the old maps of the Forest Service and actually look at what was on the ground.
Okay, thank you for that. Mr. Harvey, we've heard about families being unable to access drainages where they've hunted generations ago, and all of a sudden the decision by the Forest Service completely cuts the family off from access. We've heard about leases. I'm interested in your comments about how in your area road closures impact the public's ability to get access to the land.
Many of the people in Baker County have lived there for all their lives, their families for many years, like Mr. Carey's. The problem is now that Forest Service wants to close the road, and these are good roads, these are engineered roads, as the gentleman pointed out. The problem is we don't need engineered roads for off-wheel vehicles. And the roads that we ride in personally are old logging trails. We're not doing any damage to them. But the thing is, we pleasure ride, we don't race, and we police ourselves. We pick up trash, if there is any, we go after people who are disobeying the laws and things like that. But the coordination process could work on what roads should be or could be closed if necessary. The coordination is actually government to government. I don't need them to put out a public notice that they're having a public meeting, take everybody's input, and treat the counties as the public. That's what they do. That's not the law of coordination. Coordination is actual sitting down, designing the plans from the beginning, not coming in at the end and commenting like anybody else. If we had the opportunity to sit down and help design these plans, we could alleviate 15 years of the planning process because we would be a partner with them. And we would go to the public and say, this is what your input to us and ours to them has brought forth. And that's what coordination truly is.
Thank you. Ms. Granite, if you could comment on how these road closures have impacted your use of public lands.
As a disabled person, a mother and a grandmother, I got involved in this for a very personal reason. We went to go on a trail, and I am that fabled off-roader that takes my Jeep through the woods. I haven't raced in a really long time, but I do like a good challenge. So, you know, when I go home, I'm just an average Jeeper. But we went to go on a trail and didn't realize until we saw it that there was a gate across the road. And the road had been closed in the year interim. And I told my friends, my kids, you know, go ahead, go see the road, go see what happened. But I couldn't walk any further, and so I had to stay by the road while they went inside. And I sat by my Jeep very, very sad. Getting areas closed off to you, knowing that you will never, ever see them again. Every additional wilderness study area, every additional non-motorized backcountry. There are so many designations, and they limit access to people. And it's so many people now that are, you know, I'm a baby boomer. We're getting older. And the areas that people have had access to for years, as Representative White was saying, I work with hunters all the time who say, but I can't get back there. I can't take, you know, how can I hunt if I can't take a game cart into a wilderness? Wheelchairs are illegal in wilderness. They're not allowed. So that's the extent to where we have gotten in keeping people out.
Okay, thank you. This time, Ms. Plaskett, you have additional questions?
Yes. Yes, thank you very much. We've talked quite a bit about the travel management rule, and one of the things that we discussed is the road system, in part called the road system management, identification of unneeded roads. Forest officials should give priority to decommissioning those unneeded roads that pose the greatest risk to public safety or environmental degradation. Mr. Furnish, during your time at the Forest Service, what were some of the reasons you encountered as to why a road may be needed to be closed?
Well, one of the main reasons has to do with unmaintained roads and sedimentation that affects water quality. That's one of the big ones. Sometimes it's a single-purpose road, like for timber management, and so if you're logging an area and then you don't intend to go back there for 20 or 30 years, that was intended to log, and so when the logging is over, close the road, wait 30 years, when you come back, you can open it up again.
And are times given, is something put in that says that this road will reopen in 20 years? Or is that then you just have to just
Typically
try
not,
and?
because I think that's too far to foresee with any kind of precision.
So then how does a logger then be able to have that road reopened for them to be able to use it?
Well, generally, the road prism, the structure of the road is still there, and you can just come in with a blade of a piece of equipment and just reshape it, and it's ready for use.
But if it's closed off for those purposes, would they have
Well,
to then
there's
speak
a
with the
difference
forest
in
manager
whether
to
a
do
road
that?
has actually been decommissioned versus just closed.
Okay.
If a road has simply been closed, it can simply be reopened again by reopening a gate. But if it's been decommissioned, then it's really not intended to, for instance, log that area again.
How do you balance that against the reasons that people are given and, you know, some of the really compelling testimony that's here today with others to keep a road open?
Well, I would first make the point that closures do not necessarily reduce use. I would say they tend to concentrate use. If you have fewer roads for people to operate on, it will tend to concentrate use. But it doesn't necessarily follow that if you close 20% of the roads in an area, that 20% of the users will disappear.
Right.
That is not a corollary.
So when that happens, doesn't, that puts more stress on those roads that are being used, right?
Well, but if you have limited maintenance dollars, you want to try and apply them on the best roads you have to try and serve the using public. And I think what's been left out of much of the discussion we've had today is the people who don't use motorized vehicles, who are hikers, mountain bikers, that kind of thing. And the footprint of an off-highway vehicle is much larger than that of a pedestrian. They can cover so much more ground. And the associated noise and that type of thing, they just have a much bigger impact on the land.
The off-highway vehicles.
Yeah.
And when you talk about those off-highway vehicles and the impact that they have, road damage, et cetera, there's a variety of problems that can occur. Based on your experience, what type of problems are created when Forest Service roads, either those in the official system or those that are unauthorized, cannot be adequately maintained?
Can you rephrase that
I'm
again,
sorry.
please?
So what problems that can be created on these roads by the off-highway vehicles, the roads that are unauthorized or even those that are authorized, if you don't have the funding or the support to maintain them?
Well, I mean, one of the biggest problems has to do, again, I would say, with sediment and clean water. You also have wildlife habitat issues. There are a lot of endangered species and that kind of thing that don't relate well to motorized vehicle activity. And so trying to balance all of these things, as well as like with hunters and fishers who would prefer to practice that form of recreation without the use of off-highway vehicles, and trying to balance that with those who do, having areas to hunt and fish where you don't have off-highway vehicle trails open would be a valid consideration.
Sure. And you stated, for your own example, in Bighorn National Forest, as a Bighorn National
Yeah.
Forest Ranger, taking aggressive steps. And why was that needed in that instance?
Well, one was that we just had so many four-wheel drive roads, and they were virtually unmaintained. I will say that I've been a frequent visitor to the Bighorn in the years since, as recently as 1 year ago. And I would like to offer testimony with my own eyes that it is true that most of the off-highway vehicle users and other users of the National Forest are wonderful, law-abiding citizens. And it was a thrill to see that system in use there on the Bighorn, where they had gone through a travel planning process, had decided which roads and trails would be open, which one would be closed, and to see people out recreating openly on an accessible national forest with some restrictions and having a great time. And I was one of them.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. And the chair recognizes Mr. Gosar for 5 minutes.
So, Mr. Harvey, Ms. Gannett, are you familiar with the Arizona Peace Trail?
I'm sorry, I'm not.
I am a bit.
Okay, so this was a kind of a very well-orchestrated plan, road plan with the BLM over on the west side of Arizona. And what they did is they worked in coordination, Mr. Harvey, with the BLM to designate what roads they wanted to keep on and help manage themselves. Pretty successful, very successful. So you come back to that coordination, Mr. Harvey. It's not about just opening wanton. You made the comment that, you know, we police ourselves and we turn people in that are not abiding. Is that true,
Yes, sir.
Ms. Gannett?
Absolutely. I'm a tread trainer for Tread Lightly, and that's one of the principles that Tread Lightly teaches. We have in almost every forest in California volunteer off-road groups that go around and patrol. Particularly successful San Bernardino National Forest, Rubicon Trail. These are all patrolled by volunteers all weekend. And if they need assistance, they ask the local sheriffs for help. But we're adamant that we need proper, responsible behavior on a trail.
So, Mr. White, most of this management plan really wasn't dictated by common citizens. It was done by sue and settle, wasn't it?
Yes.
So let me get this straight. So what we did is we sued on behalf of a group, and they were named earlier on. I openly talk about Center for Biological Diversity, you know, because Mr. Furnish actually said it's more of an art, it's as much of an art as it is about science. I don't know about that. But what ends up happening is these groups come in and they sue. And then what ends up happening, there's a decision with the Justice Department. And to be honest with you, we're not entitled to see, or we haven't been able to see those forecasts. But a lot of what's happened, particularly in Arizona, is that shut down all our timber sales, by the way. You know, it was the 3 different lawsuits in 1979, and then in 81, and then in 82, and 84, and it just kept growing. And so that's why we have this problem. So you brought up the individual. Well, how does that impact a lease, like say a grazing lease?
Representative, anytime you close access, it affects anybody that has anything up there, whether it's grazing lease, whether it's a timber sale for active management, whether it's a cabin lease, whether it's a mining claim, patent mining claim. CBU got calls all the time. We can't access our mining claim anymore. You know, and that's a very popular activity, whether it's a gold panning association, which is a supporter of ours in the state, or a person actually owns a mining claim. And I will say on the litigation side, 2 groups in the state of Montana, basically 2 individuals, Alliance for the Wild Rockies and Native Ecosystems, are responsible for 70% of the litigation shutting down our timber industry. We used to have 31 mills. I think we're down to 7 or 9 or something like that within our state. And these were good paying jobs. And being in legislature, those good paying jobs being gone, we have reduced income tax collection, which reduces revenue to our state budget, which reduces the services that we can provide for the citizens of Montana. And I'm sure Mr. Harvey can tell you the problems in a county commission trying to provide services to those people in the county.
So, Mr. Harvey, going back to you, with the loss of secure rural schools, have you seen a huge impact after that?
We will. We just received it this year. We have 1 more year. But the problem is our road department, which takes care of snow removal in winter, which keeps access to everything, was reduced by half. We went from 34 employees to 17 because of the loss of revenue from timber industry. And also yet some of the sales that we do have, they tear up the roads, but we get no revenue from it anymore. We have no mill that goes to Idaho or it goes to another county in Oregon. But this aspect I have to look at from a county's perspective. Yes, the revenue diminishes, but the cost of services go up. And we either provide it as best we can or we cut services.
Well, and I want to get back to one more point, is management of the forest. A dynamic forest is a little new growth, a little medium growth, a little bit of old growth, because they all have special functions within the dynamics. And so it's not about if, it's how you have to continue to utilize and work the forest. And that's been our problem, is that we haven't been, and we're reaping the disasters that are occurring. And part of this application is the roadless rule. is closing off. I give an example here. This is a nightmare for people back home. I mean, I'll give you one more example, if I can have a little indulgence.
Yes.
We have a place called Fossil Creek. Do you know about it, Mr. Furnish?
I've heard of it.
Yeah, so what ends up happening is it's one of these wonderful areas that there's water in Arizona, for God's sakes, water. And everybody's attracted to that. But what ends up happening is that we have these things called monsoons. Do you know that they refuse to put a road in there? Actually is a road in there. They want to destroy the road. And so what ends up happening, for emergency services to get there, it takes over 8 hours and a helicopter ride.
Yes, sir.
This is absurd. This is absolutely absurd. To be able to look at a natural wonder, take care of that, and be able to have safety and access. It's just mind-boggling. I yield back.
Thank you. And we'll recognize Mr. Palmer for the final round of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the witnesses. I want to get back to the discussion that we were engaged in my first round of questions. And one of the things that I think you mentioned, Mr. Harvey, was the ability to pay for our forest management by utilizing, it may have been Representative White said this, but one of you mentioned this, by sensible forest management, that is thinning, select cutting. That's how you pay for the forest management. One of the, I was thinking about this as we were sitting here, we talked about the excessive amount of fuel on the forest floor. Anyone who's ever been to a bonfire or gone camping, it's a fairly simple notion that if you want the fire warmer, you put more wood on the fire, right?
Yes, sir.
Representative White, you ever had to do that to warm up?
Yes, sir.
Well, the more wood on the floor makes a hotter fire. And even mature trees can be killed because the fire burns too hot. That's a fundamental principle of forest fires. And you also want to be able to use fire as a management tool.
Yes, sir.
That's good for wildlife, of all sorts of wildlife. A lot of people think burning the woods is bad for wildlife, but it's good. And it's good forest management. But if there's too much fuel on the floor, you can't do that, can you?
No, sir. Much of our forests are impassable because of that same reason.
Well, and that goes back to what I said earlier about the dangers that creates for firefighters, because a fire that it burns with that intense level of heat is not only potentially deadly for the trees, it is potentially deadly for the forest firefighters that are in there. I also want to point out that there's this false narrative that when you do select cutting or when you open up federal forest lands for logging, it creates this false narrative that it's clear cutting. And that's not the case, is it?
No, sir, not in eastern Oregon especially. Like I mentioned, limited moisture for a year of 12 inches. We only do selective cutting. We cannot do clear cutting. We don't want to do clear cutting.
Well, when you have limited moisture or particularly intense droughts, when you thin, it increases, is it correct to say it increases the survivability of the remaining forest?
Yes, sir, it does. That's the design of management of forests, which they do not do anymore.
Right.
It will also raise the water table too in the ground.
Yes.
That's exactly right, because you don't have as much competition for the water. One of the other things that I want to point out, Mr. Chairman, is that there's 1.1 million acres of forest land that we've lost to forest fire and to disease that now needs to be replanted. I don't know if any of that's in Oregon or Montana or
All the time.
California. All the time. And that there's 58 million acres that are on the high or very high risk right now.
Yes, sir.
So my question is to the panel, does it make sense to continue the practices that we employ now to manage our federal forests when we've already lost millions of acres, some that it'll take years, maybe decades to recover. When there's 58 million acres that are at risk or very high risk, does it make sense to continue to limit access to these forests or to continue the management practices that allow unbelievable amounts of fuel to collect on the forest floor?
Sir, I believe that's the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over and not getting any different results.
I will not disagree with that for the record. Any other comments, Mr. Harvey?
Yes, sir, we're fighting for the potential of actually managing. When you lock it up, that's neglect, and that's destruction by neglect. We can't continue to do that. I lost 130,000 acres in the fires that I described earlier. I can't afford to do that every year. I've only got 15 years' supply at that rate. Okay, that's the rest of my county.
And there are ranchers and homeowners and other people who've suffered losses as a result of fires that burned out of control. Ms. Gannett, in regard to access for vehicles, I limit what you can drive on my forest, as we limit what can be driven on U.S. highways. And I don't understand why we can't have laws, Mr. Chairman, that allow people to operate vehicles on roads and maintain those roads, again, pay for it with the management of the forest, but have the same kind of traffic control in the forest that we do. Now, you know, you gotta catch people who abuse the law, but the same thing's true on our highways. So I just think we need a common sense approach to this. You know, make the forest accessible to people, all kinds of people, even people with impaired abilities, but also manage the forest in a way that makes sense and pay for it with the resources that we have. With that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for holding the committee. I thank the witnesses, and I yield back.
Okay, thank you. And I want to thank the witnesses as well. This is a very important discussion to make sure public has access to the public's land and we can get back to start managing our forests again. Again, I thank each of you for being here. The hearing record will remain open for 2 weeks for any member to submit a written opening statement or questions for the record. And if there's no further business, without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.